Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Berechot, chapter 2, Halacha 9, and over there in Halacha 6, it was getting into all the stuff about the groom being exempt from reciting the Shema, and now the Mishnah is going to talk about whether the groom is permitted to recite the Shema if he chooses to do so. And the Mishnah reads, if a groom wishes to recite the Shema on the first night of his marriage, he may recite it. The Rambam in Hilchos Kriyas Shema 4:7 is saying that this is provided that he clears his mind of distraction and he concentrates properly on the Shema. So, again, let me read this again. If a groom wishes to recite the Shema on the first night of marriage, he may recite it. And the Mishnah continues and says, Rabban Gamliel says, not everyone who wishes to take for himself the good name of being an exceptionally pious individual may take it. So I want to point out what the Haredim says about this. And he says that people generally are unable to achieve the proper level of concentration on the night of the wedding, and one who recites the Shema at that time is presenting himself as being more pious than others, and in that he can achieve the proper level of concentration even in those circumstances where others cannot. And this creates an appearance of haughtiness, and consequently Rabban Shimon Gamliel holds that he should not recite the Shema. Now the Tanna Kamma hold that we are not concerned about the appearance of haughtiness, and therefore they permit a groom to recite the Shema. Now, in early Talmudic times, that would be one situation, and our times today is going to be different. And today, people do not generally concentrate, even when they say the Shema on a normal day. So if a groom recites the Shema, he is not presenting himself as being pious, because it will be assumed that he is reciting it without the proper concentration anyway, just like what other people are doing during the year. And so he's not presenting himself as being more pious than other people. Very important not to present yourself as being more pious than the rest of the community that you're in. The Gemara now is gonna get talking to about Rabban Gamliel and his opinion, Rabban Shimon Gamliel's opinion, and the Brisa, which is going to illustrate this principle. Gemara says that it was taught in a Brisa regarding any matter that causes distress. Anyone who wishes to comport himself as a distinguished individual may do so, and anyone who wishes to comport himself as a Torah scholar may do so, and may blessing come to him. And basically it's saying that he acted righteously. So what is this talking about? The Haredim says that such as fasting, which is physically taxing, or refraining from work, in which a person loses the money that he could have earned from working. And what this is saying, says the Haredim, is that the Mishnah in Tanis 1:4, and the parallel being 10a in the Bavli, states that if the winter rains do not arrive by the 17th day of March Shavan, at which point they were 2 weeks late, then it says the distinguished individuals would commence a series of 3 fasts. And in reference to this law, the Brisa is teaching that even someone who does not qualify as a distinguished individual may fast if he chooses to do so. And we are not concerned about this having the appearance of haughtiness. And the Haredim is identifying the distinguished individuals as God-fearing individuals who are neither Torah scholars nor Amoratzim, being ignorant people. And basically, it's a little bit different than the Bavli. The Bavli in Tanis 10a, it's going to identify distinguished individuals as exceptional Torah scholars, who are worthy of being appointed to lead the communities. And in the Yerushalmi and Tanis 1:4, it identifies them as people who are appointed as heads of the communities and serve faithful in the capacity with a lot of fear from heaven. So a little bit difference between Bavli or Yerushalmi on that. And the Gemara is going to continue and it's going to say, but any matter that elicits praise, not everyone who wishes to comport himself as a distinguished individual may do so, nor may everyone who wishes to comport himself as a Torah scholar may do so, unless he was appointed a leader over the community. So I want to point out what's going on over here and how this is working. So a leader is going to be permitted to act in keeping with the dignity of his office. So even if he's a private individual, it would not be fitting for him to act in this way, where he's being in this manner that's going to comport himself in a way that he's going to, try to get a lot of praises, and it's permitted to adopt the distinctive manners and dresses of Torah scholars, but it's an issue if a private individual, were be, doing it, it's not normally fitting for him to act this way. Okay, so we have to, you're not allowed to become arrogant and dress like a Torah scholar just to get praise, and you're also it's also going to be an issue about trying to look very pious, and the Bryce is basically teaching that Rabban Gamliel, what he's doing is he's saying that when it's permitted to act more piously than others, and when it's forbidden to act more piously than others. And with respect to the grooms reciting the Shema, which would elicit praise, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is going to be worried about where it looks to be haughty. But in respect to an ordinary person fasting when the rains are late, or from straining from work on Tisha B'Av, which are matters of distress, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is not really worried about the appearance of haughtiness. So the Bavli is going to bring in Berechot 17b, it's going to bring two Amorim and interpretations after this opinion, and those are going to disagree with these guidelines. But nonetheless, this is what the Yerushalmi writes. So the Gemara is going to cite a related incident, but as an introduction to this incident, it cites a brisa, and it says that it was taught in a brisa, wayfarers may turn off to the sides of the roads and walk through private fields on account of the pegs of the roads. What are the pegs of the roads? The Haredim says that that in the winter, when the rains fall on the land and the dirt becomes muddy and the roads, and the trampling of the wayfarers and animals cause pits to form the roads, and when the roads dry out and harden, the ground around the pits become peg-like obstacles for travel. And the Bryce is teaching that at these times, the public's permitted to abandon these kinds of roads and go along the sides, even if it meant walking on the border of someone else's field, even while the crop was growing, says Haredim. And this is going to be, says Haredim, this is one of the conditions of land ownership stipulated by Joshua and accepted by the Jews when it originally settled Eretz Yisrael, and it says that it applies even outside of Eretz Yisrael. So the Gemara says that it was taught in Brisa, wayfarers may turn off the sides on the roads and walk through private fields on account of the pegs of the roads. Again, walking through private fields, this is going to be walking along the side of the field. And the Gemara says that, and at a time when one's foot sinks in the mud on the road, he may turn off and walk even in a field that is full of saffron. Saffron is really the most valuable crop money-wise and per weight that exists. There's nothing more expensive. It has a great flavor. It's great for cooking. If you like saffron, there's a Yerushalmi that talks about growing it in your windowsills, and that even if you're very, very poor, you can set up some pottery and stuff in your windowsills and grow saffron and sell it, because it doesn't take a lot of land and it reaches a high price. And so there's a recommendation for that if you're very poor. The Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to say about an incident. Rabbi Abahu said there was an incident involving Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yeshua, who were walking on a road, and they turned off to the sides and walked in private fields on account of the pegs of the roads. And they saw Rabbi Yeshua ben Pappus coming in the opposite direction. And they observed that as he was approaching them, he was walking on the road itself and was sinking into the mud of the road. And Rabbi Yehuda was conspicuously refusing to take advantage of the stipulation of allowing somebody to walk on the side of the road. And Rabban Gamliel said to Rabbi Yeshua, "Who is this one who is exhibiting himself as if pointing with a finger at himself and announcing his piety?" So basically, says the Marafulda, that it's unseemly for him to show off in this manner and to make himself like an extremely sincere and pious individual, and like he's showing off. And Rabbi Yeshua replied and said, "He is Yehuda ben Pappus, all of whose deeds are performed for the sake of heaven." In other words, he's saying that he really is sincere and he really is a pious individual and he's not showing off. And Rabban Gamliel said to him, "But was it not taught in a Beraisa regarding any manner that elicits praise? Not everyone who wishes to comport himself as a distinguished individual may do so, nor may everyone who wishes to comport himself as a Torah scholar may do so unless they are appointed as a leader of the community." So that's one of the key cases. Now, I want to point out some notes by the Rosh Cirilio on this, that it's pointing out that he had not been appointed the head of the community, and that even if he is sincere, he's not allowed to act this way, since people will perceive his behavior as arrogant. This is a note by the Rosh Cirilio, and basically the other idea is that by the Rosh Cirilio is that although walking in a muddy road causes distress, Rabban Gamliel classifies Rabbi Yehuda's behavior as a manner that elicits praise because of the circumstances he was acting, and the general permit to adopt a pious practice that causes distress is based on the assumption that the people will attribute the behavior to real and sincere piety rather than conceit. Here, however, Rabbi Yehuda was in fact exhibiting himself publicly as being more pious than the two great sages. And Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yeshua, since he was conspicuously walking in the muddy road at the same time as these other two sages, and that those two sages veered away from the muddy road. So that's a part of what's going on here, and that the Gemara is basically going to ask and say, what is Rabbi Yehuda's permit to act in this way? Because again, he was not a leader, and not only that there were two other great sages walking and taking advantage of this permit that came about with Joshua. So why is he different? So Gemara says that Rabbi Yeshua replied and said, "But it was also taught in the very Beraisa regarding any matter that causes distress, anyone who wishes to comport himself as an individual, a distinguished individual, may do so, and anyone who wishes to comport himself as a Torah scholar may do so, and may a blessing come upon him." In other words, what this is saying is that walking in the road under these conditions, like what Rabbi Yehuda ben Pappus was doing, did cause genuine distress, and therefore this behavior is fitting into that later category and is not really just permitted, but is actually something that's praiseworthy. In other words, says the Rosh Cirilio that Rabbi Yeshua maintained that since walking in the mud caused Rabbi Yehuda genuine distress, people would not attribute the behavior to conceit, and even though he was acting more stringently than Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yeshua. So that's a really amazing story. Now, there's another Amarah who's going to respond to Rabbi Abahu's account on this incident and is going to explain that even if Rabbi Yehuda ben Pappas's behavior did fall into that category of matters that cause distress, Rabban Gamliel had reason to object to it. So the Gemara says that Rabbi Zera said, even in matters that cause distress, one is allowed to adopt an extra stringency, only provided that he does not disgrace others. So disgracing others is going to be a different and more severe prohibition than concern for the appearance of haughtiness. And the appearance of haughtiness prohibits acting in a manner that people would attribute to conceit rather than real piety. And the Haredim says that Rabbi Zera is teaching that even when people will recognize and act as sincere piety, it is prohibited if it will cause them to have a lower regard of others who acted less piously. Thus, in any situation this result can be foreseen, one is forbidden from performing pious practices in public. In other words, you're making these other people who are also pious look unpious, and that's going to be an issue. And you're actually, in a way, causing them disgrace. So in this case, since Rabbi Yehuda ben Pappas acted publicly in a manner that made Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yeshua seem less pious than him, in a way, he was disgracing them. And this is a reason for this objection by Rabban Gamliel. So that's another key thing, and another problem when you go and you act very, very piously is that you're taking other people who might actually be more learned than you, and you're making them look like they're not pious. And then that's also a problem, because one day when they give halachic rulings or something like that, people might not listen to them. They might say, oh, this other guy is more pious, this one is not so pious, even though that he's acting in accordance with the halacha. So in normal life, it's very serious to be presenting yourself as being more pious than the other people around you, because you're diminishing the people who might actually be more pious than you or more learned than you. So the Gemara now is going to talk about another incident. And the Gemara says that there was an incident in which Rabbi Yasa and Rabbi Shmuel bar Yitzchak were sitting and eating in someone's in the synagogue attic, and the time for mincha prayer came, and Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak interrupted his meal, stood up to pray, and Rabbi Mashaya said to him, "Did Rebbe not teach us in the Mishnah, if they begin an activity such as eating a meal, and the time for prayer arrived, they do not have to interrupt it to pray, rather they may finish their activity and then pray?" In other words, they're asking, why did you interrupt your meal? In other words, it's also saying, hey, are you being more pious than everybody else here? The Gemara is going to continue and says, you cannot legitimately say that you wish to act more stringently than the law requires, because Hiskia taught in a Brisa that states, anyone who is exempt from something and who nevertheless performs it is called a simpleton. So Hiskia is basically pointing out, says the pre something from an introduction to the pre Megadim, where it says that that is far from being praiseworthy. He actually detracts from his stature by performing his deed, and this is because he should not be doing something that creates an impression of haughtiness. So I want to point out that in the Rosh's commentary in Eruvin 96a, it's basically saying about a parallel. It's saying that there are situations in which it is considered meritorious to perform an act from which he is exempt. But as a general rule, like in talking about in Kiddushin, women are not obligated to perform the positive commandments that apply only at certain times, and nevertheless, it is considered meritorious for them to perform these mitzvahs, and according to many authorities, they may even recite a blessing before performing one of these mitzvahs, but the Bryce's teaching does not apply there, because in those situations, there are other people who are obliged to perform those mitzvahs, and women who perform these mitzvahs, there's going to be no appearance of haughtiness, because she's not presenting herself as being any better than many men who perform these mitzvahs. And the Bryce's teaching applies only when one adopts an extra stringency that no one is required to perform, such as interrupting a meal to pray immediately. Since no one is obliged to perform that act, then one who does so creates an impression of acting haughty, and he presents himself as being more pious than everyone else there. So again, the idea is that somebody who is exempt from something and then goes and performs it anyway, isn't he called a simpleton? Now that's a complicated idea, and the Or Chaim in 32.8 is pointing out that if there's some doubt regarding a person's exemption, or there's some disagreement among the poskim regarding it, then even if accepted halachic practice allows one to be lenient, one may nevertheless choose to conduct himself in the accordance with the more stringent possibility. So again, you don't want to be sitting there disparaging effectively the other people around you by going and doing this. So Rabbi Shmuel responds, and he said to Rabbi Mayasha, but we learned in the Mishnah, a groom is exempt from the Shema recital, but if the groom wishes to recite the Shema, he may recite it. In other words, they're pointing out that this is an anonymous Mishnah, and this anonymous Mishnah disagrees with the brisa that Rabbi Mayasha cited, and is holding that one may perform an extra stringency which the law exempts him from performing. And in keeping with this Mishnah, he's basically saying that he's allowed to interrupt the meal in order to pray, even if by law he is not required to do so. Because again, he's referring to an anonymous Mishnah. Now, Rabbi Mashaya is going to counter, and he's going to say, he said to Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, but does this anonymous ruling of the Mishnah not reflect the opinion of Rabban Gamliel, who recited the Shema on the night of his wedding, as we learned in the previous Mishnah? And basically, he's saying that, we learned over there that, other rabbis disagreed with him, and the anonymous Mishnah is actually reflecting only a minority opinion and should not be relied upon. Rather, what this is saying is that you should follow the opinion of the Beraisa, which is teaching that you should not act in a way that's more stringent than what the law applies, and that Beraisa, in fact, is going to be the majority opinion of the rabbis. And Rabbi Shmuel is going to retort, and he's going to say, and he says to Rabbi Mayasha, I concede that I can and should interpret this Mishnah as following the view of Rabban Gamliel. For Rabban Gamliel said in the Mishnah above, I will not listen to you to remove the acceptance of the sovereignty of heaven from myself, even for one moment. So in that Mishnah, he's doing so because he wants to put on himself as quickly as possible and run to accept the yoke of heavenly sovereignty. And, the Mishnah that he's referring to in Halacha 6 is when Rabban Gamliel recited the Shema on the wedding night, and the students couldn't understand why he was doing it. And he replies back to the students, I want to have the acceptance of the yoke of heaven, and I don't want to get away from it, not even from a moment. So basically, the reply that he has over there is that I'm doing an act that is not an act of piety because I'm trying to show people up and look and be haughty. It's because the acceptance of prayer is the acceptance of the yoke of heavenly sovereignty, and I don't want to run away from that as a Jew, not even for a moment. And it's so important that we internalize this, and that you know we're we're doing whatever it takes to accept the yoke of heavenly sovereignty upon ourselves, because that's really the point of being alive and being a Jew. Have a great day.